بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين آمين بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. We're going to inshallah continue the story of Yunus, not the prophet Yunus but the fictional Yunus that we've been talking about. Part of the story is true story, but then most of it is fiction. So just a quick recap. Last week we mentioned that Yunus and his two companions, one of them name is Mustafa, the other one we don't know yet, the guy who lost his memory, who used to always ask people, do you know the meaning of Kalimat Tawheed? They were stuck in a village in the middle of the desert, maybe it was an oasis, and they got attacked by some gang who said they were working for a guy named Babe, right? And they barely made it out of there with their lives, and somehow the guy who doesn't even know his name, he was able to fight off 12 people using, amazing skill. And Yunus and his brother Mustafa are amazed, how does he know how to fight? But they put that aside, they escaped with their lives, and they end up in another village after crossing the desert where there was a drought. There was no water. And Yunus remembers a dua Shaykh taught him, which was called Salah, what kind? Istisqa, Salat al-Istisqa. What is Salat al-Istisqa?
It makes it rain.
It's a prayer asking for rain. As soon as they did that, what happened? It started raining. And the people in that village, they said, you guys are, Allah sent you here, you're heroes. And they start getting famous little by little. People start talking about them. There's these three companions traveling, and their du'as are mustajab. Their du'as are accepted du'as. And so people were talking about them. Now what happened? Yunus and his companions, they made it back to the city where Yunus's father is the governor. Not the mayor, the governor. And in those times, there was every province, every single patch of land had a governor over it. So the entire state of Iraq would have one governor. So the governor was almost like the king, right? The entire state of Egypt would have one governor, right? And all of these different provinces, they have governors of their own, but all the governors, they report to a higher authority who was called the Khalifa. Khalifa, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of the believers. So Yunus's father is the governor of that entire area. Now, when Yunus arrives to the palace of his father, he's got his friend Mustafa with him and the brother who doesn't remember his name. And they find his father sitting down and talking with some guy, and they're having a tea, and they're laughing, and they're mentioning some things. And his father sees Yunus and he welcomes him, says, Yunus, my son, where have you been? And Yunus says, oh father, I had gone to study with the sheikh, and I learned, and then I had a long journey after that. He says, no problem, you look tired, you look beat up, your hair is all ungroomed, because they're travelers, they came from the desert. What do they look like? They look like bums. They have the dusty clothing, their hairs are all shaggy and everything. They haven't trimmed their beards for a long time. They look like, homeless people. And so the father, he says, go get freshened up and everything. Oh, by the way, this is my good friend. He's a general in one of our armies. He's very popular. He fought this battle, that battle. His name is Babe. Babe. Now remember Babe? People were talking about a guy named Babe who had, slaves, who was robbing caravans, who was doing all these bad things in this hidden village in the middle of the desert. So immediately Yunus thinks, maybe that's the guy Babe. And the person who has lost his memory, when he sees Babe, he recognizes him, his eyes widen, he says, I know this guy. I have seen him somewhere. But he doesn't remember anything because what happened to him, remember? How did he lose his memory? In the battle. How did he lose his memory in the battle? He fell off his horse. His people around him got, decimated. And what happened? He woke up. He didn't remember anything. And the only thing he could remember was the last things he was trying to say, which was what? Kalima Tawheed, La ilaha illallah. And from that moment on, he became insane. He lost his memory and he lost his mind. But how did he get his mind back? Yunus did something to him. What did Yunus do?
He put his hand on his forehead and said,
And read Quran. What is that called? When you put your hand over the sick person and read Quran?
That's what I did to my dad.
Huh? It's called? Who knows? Who knows? Ruqya. Yeah, it's called Ruqya. The Prophet ﷺ used to do Ruqya on people. So what happens? Now, Yunus thinks, is that the baig that we're talking about in the village? He says, Father, I'm going to freshen up, but there's something really important I need to talk to you about. His father says, don't worry, go and take care of yourself. Come back afterwards, we'll have a chat. So Yunus goes away, he freshens himself up, he's given new clothes, he's given new, he fixes his hair. His friends also do the same thing. And they come back to talk to the father, and he's still having a meeting with his general. So Yunus stands at the door and says, may I enter, father? His father says, come in, Yunus. We're in very, very difficult times. We need your input on some of the strategies we're coming up. And so Yunus enters and he sits down and he says, General Beg is suggesting that we move our armies here because the Persian armies are going to attack and they have been relentless and we have lost too many soldiers in the battle against them. What do you think? If we defend the north and leave the south, because more than likely the Persians are going to attack from the north. Yunus looks at the map and he notices in the southeast there's that desert where they were lost. And somewhere in that desert there was what?
A village.
A village. And it's not on the map. So Yunus, he looks at the map and he says, Father, what if the armies of the Persians are going to come from the south? I mean, what do we know about this desert? And as soon as he says, what do we know about this desert? Beg kind of looks up with interest what he's about to say. He says, I'm not sure, but don't you think there's a village or something here? Maybe there are people that can tell us about this. And he gives a glance at Beg to see his facial expressions. Beg says, Governor, we're wasting our time. The Persian armies are gathering on the northern borders. I am the general, I have military intelligence. You have to believe what I say. And the governor says, Beg, I trust you 100%. You have been my friend from a long time ago. You have led many, many armies and you have won many victories. I trust you and I trust your intelligence. I was just taking the opinion of my son. If you think we should move our armies north, then we will move them north. Yunus says, but shouldn't we also look at the south? What if they attack from the south? The father says, Yunus, you are a judge. You have studied about law. You have studied about judgment. Military matters. Let's leave it up to the people that studied military matters. Yunus, he doesn't know what to say. He realizes his father has been what?
Brainwashed.
He's been brainwashed by this general, and he's not even sure if that's the bad guy or not. So he says, no problem, father. If you say, that's what it is. And as he's walking out, he says, oh, by the way, father, I was in that village where I studied. He was going to talk about the village in the desert. But then he says, maybe I shouldn't say anything in the presence of Beg. He says, his father's looking, what village? He says, there's the sheikh in the village. I've studied with the sheikh. He's a very great teacher. Beg says, I brought my son with me. Take him to that village. I want him to study also. Yunus says, no problem. What's your son's name? He says, his name is Abdullah. He says, okay. So they go out. He says he's in the guest quarters. You can meet him there. I'll send a message to him so he can go to the village with you. So Yunus, he walks out. He's thinking, good thing I didn't tell him about the village. What if he is really that big that people are talking about? I'm going to be in trouble because he looks like he's got my father in his pocket. He's a general. I don't know how many soldiers he's got spying in the city. I need to be careful. And Beg is also getting suspicious of Yusuf. So Yusuf, Yunus, he goes over to the guest quarters and he finds this young man. His name is Abdullah. He starts talking to him and he realizes this boy is not a bad person. He says, what would you like to do in your life? How do you find the city? And they start having a conversation and he says, your father sent me to take you to this teacher. What happened between Yunus and his teacher?
He got expelled.
He got expelled. Why did he get expelled?
Because he was complaining.
he was complaining and somebody was spreading rumors about him. Remember that whole thing? So Yunus is reluctant to go back to the city and meet his teacher. But now that his father and Beg said that you should go back, he's thinking, I have no choice now. So he goes and he gets his friends. Mustafa, who was also a student of the sheikh. And the other person who was, who has lost his memory, he goes and they grab him also. And they say, we're going to meet the teacher, let's go. So now the four of them, they travel. They go back to that, place where the teacher was. They go to the mountain and Yunus stops by the door and he says, I don't think I should go in. Teacher said he doesn't want to see my face ever again. And as he's standing there, the teacher opens the door and he says, you are where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to be. Enter. They enter. And Yunus is kind of embarrassed to be standing there, but the sheikh looks at him and he says, Yunus, whatever happened in the past, qaddar Allah, maktub. You know what maktub means? It was written. It was written. It is something that happened, you cannot change it. You have to accept what happened. Now we have to look to the future. He says the future is ahead of us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preparing people for a great event that's coming. And Yunus, I need you to sit here. We have something important to talk about. But before we talk, let us pray our Maghrib prayer. So the sheikh stands up to pray Maghrib. The people behind him stand up. And the person who lost his memory, he doesn't know how to pray. He forgot. He says, Sheikh, how do I pray? He says, first thing you need to do is make wudu. He says, when you wash your body with the water of wudu, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, it's going to wash away your sins. And he says, you have to first, 4 parts are the necessary parts. When you make wudu, 4 parts are the most important parts. Start with your hands, then wash your face, then wipe water over your head, and then wash your feet. If you do that, that's enough. But if you do more than that, it's better. He says, what can I do more than that that's better? He says, after you wash your hand, you can rinse your mouth and rinse your nose. He says, how come? He says, because we say things with our mouth sometimes, our language, and all of these sins that we commit with our language, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala washes it away when you rinse your mouth. When you rinse your nose, every place that you've been to, every bad company that you kept, the smell of the evil that was around us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purifies your nose. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, shaitan can sit inside your nose. And when you wash the water up and blow it out, you blow the shayateen out from your nose. And he said, after you wash your face, you wipe your head, you wash your hands to the elbows, you wash your feet, then you're ready to pray. He says, then, okay, so I'm going to do that. So the sheikh teaches them how to make the wudu. After he teaches them the wudu, everybody's facing the qibla, and the person is standing there and looking at them. Okay, what do I do now? Everybody's facing the qibla. You have to also face the qibla. And the sheikh says, the qibla is the direction towards the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you face the qibla, he says, a lot of people, they look to the qibla and they want to fix their prayers, and the whole time in the prayer, they're trying to put their foot on the foot of the other person. He says they're not looking at the qibla. He says looking at the qibla is you have to turn with your heart to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You have to turn with your heart to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and your attention and your focus should be focused on the oneness of Allah, the power of Allah, the majesty of Allah, the beauty of Allah. He says only then you're facing the qibla. And he goes through the whole process. He teaches them the prayer, and after they finish the prayer, the sheikh says, there's a war coming. There's a war coming. And this war, it can only be won by people who become awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yunus says, how can we win a war by becoming awliya of Allah? He says, haven't you heard Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say in a hadith Qudsi that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whoever shows hostility, whoever fights against my awliya, I declare war against that person. He says, if you want to win your battles, you have to be a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you have Allah on your side, what war can you lose? What war can you lose? And they're thinking, subhanallah, it's true. If you are by yourself, but you have Allah with you. And you're fighting an entire army, who's going to win? Allah's help is going to win all the time. And the Shaykh says, let me tell you what happened with the great battle between Talut and Jalut. He says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave this man, Talut, kingship. And Allah told him to gather his armies. And he gathered 50,000 soldiers. 50,000 soldiers. Trained soldiers. Strong soldiers. He said, but not all of them were awliya. They didn't have a connection with Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to show that to him. And He said, take your soldiers out through the desert, march through the desert, and get to a water and tell them, you cannot drink from the water. And so they marched in the desert and they were thirsty and they were tired. And when they got to the water, their general Talut told them, you cannot drink from the water. And as he's telling the story, the guy who lost his memory, his head starts to feel tingly. He says, I know that story. I studied it when I was young. He says, what happened then? He says, all of them drank except for 300 people. He says, 313 people. All the rest of them drank. Out of 50,000 soldiers, only 313 didn't drink. He said, Talut told his soldiers, you cannot fight in my army except for these 313. Why? Because these people, they proved their faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They proved their strength of will that if Allah wants to take care of me, if Allah is there for me, I don't need anything else. And on the day when the battle comes, if your heart is not connected with Allah, you're going to fear the enemy more than you're going to fear Allah. And that's going to be the downfall. And he said in the end of time, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, when the final battle happens, people will go out against the enemies of Allah. And out of the Muslims, 12,000 soldiers, 1/3 of them will turn their backs and run away. Allah will never forgive them. Allah will never forgive them. So, be a wali of Allah. It says, what happened? Those 313 people fought against thousands of soldiers. And when the armies met, the first person that stepped out was Jalut, the giant. And he was faced by a young boy named Dawood, prophet of God. And Jalut said, is this your best fighter? Is this the best one you got? And he started laughing. And he said, I don't want to hurt you, kid. Go home. And Dawood said, you don't want to fight me, but I want to fight you, enemy of God. Let's fight. And Jalut said, if that's what you want, if you have a death wish, and he started charging at him with his sword. And Dawood picked up a pebble, put it in his slingshot, pulled it back, and let go. They have rubber bands. And what happened? This pebble, slow motion, flying through the air. And Jalut is riding on his horse, with his sword raised up, and the pebble touches Jalut in the middle of his forehead, and Jalut drops dead. He said it wasn't the pebble that killed him, it wasn't the slingshot that killed him, it wasn't the child that killed him, but the victory was given to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How many times Allah gave victory for a small group over a bigger group when they believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they are walis of Allah. And as they're sitting there and they're listening, they said, how do we become a wali of Allah? How can we become a wali of Allah? The Shaykh said, you have to first perfect what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made obligatory for you. Perfect your prayers, perfect your fasting, perfect your Hajj, perfect your Ramadan, perfect your character. Once you perfect what is obligatory, then you do what's extra until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will love you, and then nothing can hurt you. They said, Khalas, ya Shaykh, we're going to do that. Now, one more thing, Shaykh. He said, we were traveling and we came across this village. There was these people, you know, they looked like they needed help, and they said they had about 800 people enslaved by this man named Beg. And as they're talking about Beg, his son said, Beg, my father? He said, oh, we forgot he was with us. He said, I don't know if it's your father, but there was a man named Beg they were all afraid of. And Abdullah said, I know my father, he's busy always fighting, but I don't know him that well. But we ask Allah to guide him. Ya Shaykh, I want to study with you, can I stay here? The Shaykh said, we don't say come to those who leave, and we don't say leave to those who come. You can stay and you can study with me. But before you begin your training, I want to teach you a dhikr that will purify your heart, that will bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it will prepare you spiritually for when you start to engage in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, say the words, La ilaha illallah. He said, when you say La ilaha illallah, turn to your left, say La ilaha, turn to your heart, say Illallah. La ilaha illallah. Every night before you sleep, do this. He said, the Prophet ﷺ said, these are the best words. And after some talk and discussion, Abdullah decided to stay. Yunus, Mustafa, and the person who lost his memory, they decided to go on. They went back, and as they're going back, they started to talk to each other. They said, we have a serious problem. This beg, I don't know if it's the real guy. Let's find out if he is the true person that we're looking for. Can one of us spy on him? Yunus said, don't you remember what Sheikh told us the other day when we were studying? He said, no, I don't remember. Remind me. He said, remember Umar ibn al-Khattab? Who's Umar ibn al-Khattab? Khalifa. He said, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he was walking by the streets of Medina one day. And he heard some music from somebody's house. And he thought, music in the house of a believer when it's time for prayer? What's going on? So instead of knocking on the door, he decided to find out what's going on. He climbed over the wall, and when he climbed over, he saw this man with a bottle of alcohol. He was drinking the alcohol, and he had girls singing for him, and Omar got so mad, he jumped over the wall, he rushed over to this person, grabbed him, picked him up, pinned him against the wall. He said, you, drinking alcohol? How dare you? You know, I'm going to take you and we're going to punish you publicly. And the man said, oh, Amir al-Mu'mineen, please let me go, please let me go. You know, don't hurt me. And he said, but you are also making a mistake. He said, you broke into my house without my permission. You came in and you invaded my privacy. And Umar, he's the guy who's drunk and he's got girls singing for him. He's accusing Umar of doing something wrong. Umar dropped him. And he felt so embarrassed. He walked out. And the next day, they're sitting in the masjid, and Umar radiallahu anhu was giving the khutbah, and in the back of the masjid, he saw this person sitting there. His head is covered up, and he's sitting there, and he's listening to the khutbah. And Umar realized he has never seen this person in the khutbah before. And what happened after the khutbah, the man came up to Umar radiallahu anhu. He said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. Umar said, before you say anything, I'm sorry I broke into your house. I didn't mean to do that. Please forgive me. And the man started crying. He said, no, after you came in and you admonished me, I realized how wrong I was. I made tawbah and asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive me. And please, you also don't share my secret with anybody. Umar said, your secret is safe with me. You don't share my secret with anybody that I broke into your house. He said, your secret is safe with me. So what we learned, he said, Sheikh told us, you cannot spy on people. Because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbid it. Even if you think the guy's guilty, we can't spy on him. Then Mustafa started scratching his beard. He said, then how do we find out if he's guilty or not? He said, I'm not sure, but let's see what happens. So they go back to the city. And they find out the armies are going up where? North, to fight the Persians. And Beg, he decides, he says, all these armies are going up north. He says, the Persians are more than likely going to come from the north, so we're going to defend there. So all the soldiers, let's go. And as he's going out, he has a glance at the three people that are coming back into the city. And he notices the person who lost his memory, now all cleaned up, wearing good clothes, his hair is nice. And as soon as he sees him, Beg's eyes go wide. He's like, oh, there is a recognition. He remembers him. He recognizes him. And as soon as he sees him, he covers his face. He says, let's go, let's go, let's go. And the soldiers march off. And Yunus notices that. Mustafa notices that. But the man standing there, he's like, what happened? He saw me and he ran. They asked him, what were you before you lost your memory? I had dreams you were fighting in the army, you were a general. Did you fight alongside Beg at all? Were you a general in the army with him? And he's thinking, soldiers, 313 soldiers. Talut and Jalut. He says, I remember I used to be a general. He says, I remember. No, I don't remember. Right, they're like, please, what can we do for you to remember? He says, you know, I don't know. let's go around the city, look at different places. Maybe something will jog his memory. So they take him from place to place inside the city. And one of the places they go to is the prison, where there are people locked up inside the prison. And who is the one who used to send them to prison? The judge. So when they go to the prison, as soon as they enter, one of the prisoners sees them walk in, and he says, "You!" He jumps over, he tries to come out from the bar, the bars, and he tries to grab Yunus. He says, you put me in here, when I get out, I'm going to come after you. I'm going to do this to you, I'm going to do that. Starts screaming, and who's in the prison mostly? What kind of people? Criminals. And Yunus, he walks by, he says, "Don't worry about these guys. This one, he was caught doing something really bad. He almost burned down an entire house trying to steal from them, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him his punishment. He's locked up for a while. Before the judgment comes, they're going to cut his hands." He said, "Why are they going to cut his hands?" He says, "Don't you know that if a person goes out of their way to steal something that is hidden, somebody has hid something inside the safe, and they come and they try to take it, that person has committed a sin so great, they don't deserve to keep their hands. And it's not my ruling. Whose ruling is this? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." The Mustafa, he starts thinking, "I'm a blacksmith. I work with my hands. If I were to lose my hands, it would be a terrible thing." He says, "How many people have you cut their hands off so far?" He says, "Here's the secret. No one." He says, "What?" "Nobody in the city has had their hands cut off yet." "Then why do we have that ruling if we haven't applied it yet?" He said, "The ruling is to prevent people from stealing. If you think you're going to get your hand cut off when you do something like this, are you likely to steal or not?" No. It's a preventative. He said there is no pleasure in punishing people. Islam is a religion which teaches us to rectify people, to help people to fix their problems, not to punish them. He says, "I have a group of people coming to meet this guy next week. They're going to try to get him to make tawbah. If he makes tawbah, he's out free." And so they said, "Okay, that makes sense." And so they continue, and they come to a place in this jail, and they see this old man sitting there. And as soon as the man sees him, he says, "I remember him." He says, "I remember him." He says, "He was in the Persian army. He was in the Persian army. He was one of the spies we caught. I remember him." And Yunus says, "What do you remember? Tell me more, tell me more." He says, "This guy, he was spying, and he was pretending to be one of the people who serves food to the armies. And what happened, we caught him one day writing letters to the Persian soldiers." And he says, "I remember his letters. I remember where his letters were. Let's go to that place." And the guy grabs him by the hand. He starts rushing down the street. And they go down the street. He goes to this old abandoned house. And inside he finds a box. He opens up the box. He pulls out a letter. And he says, "General Beg sends you messages. From the army, they're going to meet at this place at this time. And meet them in this time. And bring this many soldiers. Their armies don't have any kind of defense against catapults. Bring catapults, bring elephants, and you will win this battle." Who sends the message? General Beg. And as they're looking at this, they say, "Beg? He's our general. He betrayed our own soldiers?" He says, "We got to get this message right away to the governor." And so they grab the letter. As they start going towards the governor's office, a group of soldiers come around them, and they grab them and they say, "All three of you are under arrest." So what are we under arrest for? We haven't done anything wrong. General Beg has sent us, and he noticed amongst you there's a criminal. Somebody who betrayed the army and ran away from the fight. The general has sent the criminal to be punished and anybody that's seen with him. So all three of you are coming with us. And they try to run away, but the soldiers surround him, and they got their swords, and they come down, and one of them, boom, hits Yunus over the head, and Yunus knocks out. And that's where we're going to stop. We're going to continue another cliffhanger. We're going to continue next week, inshallah. There's pizza. Go to the pizza.